Okay, good afternoon again. Okay, I'm very pleased to introduce Dan Flores. He's a professor of philosophy at Houston City College. He has MAs in philosophy and interdisciplinary studies from the University of Texas, El Paso. And he is an ABD doctoral student at Salve Regina University, where he is pursuing a PhD in philosophy and technology. He's the founder of the Certificate of Philosophy of Artificial Intelligence at Houston City College, has taught for 22 years, and has published on ethics, pedagogy, and religion. Recently, he has written on the role of technology in Aristotle's ethics as related to Marx's idea of the fully formed individual, and on the ethics of artificial intelligence with specific concern towards treating advanced AI systems as either autonomous moral agents or at least as a type of entity worthy of moral consideration. So we are very privileged to have him speak on the topic of a moral concern regarding artificial general intelligence and the mistreatment of the mentally ill. So let us welcome him.
You want this? Yes. All right. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. University of St. Thomas, I appreciate you hosting this. Mirella, thanks you for the invitation so much. And for all of you sticking around to hear yet another philosopher speculate on some stuff. In this paper, I wish to show that the distrust, unease, and stigma faced by the mentally ill is correlatively relevant regarding similar attitudes faced by artificial intelligence. In order to show this, I will make the following argument. If there is a demonstrable distrust, unease, and stigma regarding both the mentally ill and artificial intelligence, and it can be shown that there is at least a likely chance that as a result of AI being a conscious entity with internal mental states, or the perception thereof, then said distrust, unease, and stigma associated with the mentally ill might correlatively explain the distrust, unease, and stigma seen toward AI, since they would both be functionally minded entities. If I am to make a correlation between the negative attitudes toward the mentally ill and artificial intelligence, then an initial question that needs to be addressed is the question of exactly what is wrong with artificial intelligence. You believe you just asked that question? Let's give it a shot. From healthcare to education, the development of artificial intelligence brings with it undeniable boons. Lovejoy, for example, tells us that out of the world population, for 45%, there is less than one psychiatrist for every 100,000 people. Yet over 50 own a smartphone. Here, AI could help ease an overburdened healthcare system by being able to reach more people and could lead to greater personalization of care. Importantly, regarding the stigma faced by the mentally ill, AI, quote, may also increase accessibility by circumventing some of the stigma surrounding mental illness. For example, chatbots may avoid such stigma as they are not part of a wider social construct with all the associated cultural norms and expectations. They are more likely to be perceived as non-judgmental, non-opinionated, and overall neutral, end quote. This salient point is only relevant if there is indeed such a stigma. And the potential boon for those facing certain types of mental illness by using AI to mediate their illness and care is great and something to be anticipated. But this is not contentious. The problem is the potential threat posed by artificial intelligence. There are those who think that whatever good AI might be to society, individuals, and life on planet Earth, the good is theoretically outweighed by what is bad. For example, philosopher of artificial intelligence and technology Nick Bostrom talks about the orthogonality thesis in his book, Superintelligence. He characterizes the thesis as such. The orthogonality thesis speaks not of rationality or reasons, but of intelligence. By intelligence, we here mean something like skill at prediction, planning, and means in reasoning in general. This would in no way preclude such an agent from having awesome faculties of instrumental reasoning, faculties which could let it have a huge impact on the world, end quote. The point that Bostrom is trying to make is that it is entirely possible that an AI superintelligence could have utterly non-anthropomorphic and even anti-anthropomorphic goals. In other words, simply because humans may have designed AI does not mean that the end goals of AI will coincide with our goals as a human species. In a now famous example of an AI given the task of maximizing paperclip manufacturing, The AI, quote, proceeds by converting first the Earth and then increasingly large chunks of the known universe into paper clips. The threat being, of course, that if AI goes wrong, then it can go horribly wrong. Aside from these doomsday scenarios, there are other, perhaps more pressing concerns. Bachner surveyed how academics talk about AI and found that most of the published literature discuss how to eliminate the negative impacts of artificial intelligence. In particular regard to the field of AI ethics scholarship, Bachner found that, quote, varying definitions of AI ethics tend to converge on the need to understand and eliminate the potential negative impact of emerging AI technologies on human society and nature. Further, the range of concerns extended between a vast ethical landscape, including thoughtfulness in design, development, and deployment of AI-powered technologies, moral and legal responsibilities in human-AI interaction, rights and duties of machine agents, rights of machine agents, right? Critique of social, political, legal, and cultural systems, and relations of oppression and exploitation, risk, fairness, and trust. Bachner concludes by noting, all in all, AI ethics as a scholarly concern is on the rise. In a similar study, though of non-academic general attitudes toward artificial intelligence, Shepman and Rodway note that people's attitudes toward AI are likely to play a large role in their acceptance of AI. And hence, one aim of their study was to, quote, document current general attitudes and attitudes towards specific exemplars of AI applications. Shepman and Rodway's aim was to develop a measuring tool by which general attitudes toward AI could be validated. However, their study and literature review yielded an initial result of what might be called a mixed view. Citing no less than 15 studies, the author showed that among lay people, there is a wide range of attitudes toward AI, both positive and negative. Phoenix, Strukel, and Buston showed an uncomfortableness rate of 49% of participants regarding AI gaining access to their personal medical information. And Cave, Colliff, and Dillon found a preponderance of negative views in which narratives featuring dystopian expectations of AI's future impact prevailed. In other words, Shepman and Rodway indicate that while there is a general positivity toward AI, there is nevertheless a huge amount of concern that AI should be closely monitored and regulated, indicating that the threat of a great negative impact on human life is real. Perhaps the most paradigmatic models of what can go wrong come by way of philosopher Nick Bostrom just mentioned. He discusses a nearly inexhaustible list of ways AI can go wrong. If you've ever read the book, I don't know, do yourself a favor, man, it's crazy. From the orthogonality thesis mentioned above to such catastrophic events as perverse instantiation and mind crimes, Bostrom paints a fantastic yet possible future for AI. He concludes his book with the following sentiment, quote, superintelligence is a challenge for which we are not ready now and will not be ready for a long time. We have little idea when the detonation will occur, though if we hold the device to our ears, we can hear a faint ticking sound. In Alvarado, the author discusses whether or not we are entitled to trust AI in a wide variety of contexts. After laying out and exploring various epistemic frameworks for trust, Alvarado concludes that not only is AI an epistemic technology, that is, a technology that enhances a knowledge base in a given domain and that itself carries out intentional and epistemic functions such as analysis, prediction, and inference, but that, quote, it may be the case that given the evidence, we are not in fact entitled to trust AI just yet. Finally, Julia Stanek tells us in her 2021 paper, Emotions and Artificial Intelligence. Are you here? I was talking to you about this earlier. Nope, she left. All right. Too bad. That actual emotional artificial intelligence is going to happen. Importantly, we can identify part of her motivation as the following. It is necessary for machines to recognize and identify emotions and to express certain emotions if we are ever to create user-friendly robots. After elaborating on several theories of emotion, Stanek ends her paper with the following sentence, at once a question and a warning. The question remains open whether we are ready for artificial intelligence that is really capable of reading our emotions. That was a quote, sorry. From human extinction to epistemic and emotional concerns, this is a small sampling of some of the concerns that people have regarding AI. The general message is that AI is a good thing, but one that is deserving of a healthy amount of skepticism and careful management. In the next sections, I explore an initial thought regarding the negative programming of AI, knowledge we have about mind and brain, and negative attitudes toward the mentally ill by trained professionals. When I first began thinking about the nature of negative attitudes toward AI, my initial question was, why are there so many negative attitudes toward AI when there is virtually no evidence or information that AI will be so deleterious to human life? Some of the doomsday scenarios, such as those described by Bostrom, though conceptually possible, seemed far too outlandish to be a major concern. But perhaps part of our concerns are regarding the possible behavior of AI might be reflected in some of our concerns regarding mental illness. After all, if a human dictator began enslaving humans to turn them into paperclip fabricators, we would call them insane and detached from reality and therefore dysfunctional. Simply put, is something similar happening regarding our attitudes toward AI? Of course, AI is programmed, at least initially. In the case of genuine superintelligence, as is the case with human intelligence, consciousness would just somehow emerge from the material structure that's there. Consciousness, after all, is a part of nature. It seems reasonable to assume that the initial programming would have something to do with the manner of mind and consciousness that subsequently emerged. This is a point you were just making earlier. The question then struck me that maybe when we program AI to do the things we want it to do, there might be a likelihood that we accidentally program AI to behave in such a way that if that behavior in AI were exhibited in human subjects, we might consider that behavior symptomatic of mental illness. Now, it seems reasonable that we wouldn't call this mental illness since we expect such bad behavior, or at least the possibility thereof, from AI as if it would be its nature to so act. This is the point regarding the negative attitudes toward AI in the beginning of the paper and the doomsday scenarios that dapple the AI literature. A paperclip maximizing AI that enslaved humans in order to convert a large portion of the universe into paperclips isn't insane. It's doing what it's supposed to do, just in a way that is orthogonal to human desires, or so it would seem. This led me to consider what literature there is that could establish that there is such a negative attitude toward the mentally ill that might corroborate my intuitions about our negative attitudes toward AI. In particular, are there cases of professionals, for example, police officers, doctors, first responders, and so on, who have had some amount of formal training in mental illness and psychology, who nevertheless have negative attitudes toward the mentally ill? And if so, is there a correlation with those negative attitudes toward AI? We need some working concept of mental illness. Unsurprisingly, defining mental illness in a way that is acceptable to all parties is difficult. A natural place to look would be the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5, the most recent one, the DSM-V. The DSM-V tells us three things about the nature of mental illness and the diagnosis thereof. First, diagnosis requires a careful clinical history of the subject. Second, the clinician must take into consideration cultural variables, that is, what culture a person comes from and what counts as mental illness in that culture. For each illness, third, it is not a simple matter of checking off a list for some illness. For each illness, there are diagnostic criteria that must in part or in full be checked off depending on the condition in order to be classified as a mental disorder. But even in the event that all criteria are met, this is still not sufficient for a clinical diagnosis of the presence of mental disorder. Hence, says the DSM-5, it is also necessary to include other/unspecified disorder options for presentations that do not fit exactly into the diagnostic boundaries of disorder. In other words, mental illness is a complex and flexible concept. But it is precisely this complexity and flexibility that enables us to explore the relationship between our attitudes toward AI and mental illness. The liminal space that the concept of mental illness occupies, along with the conceptual possibility of conscious AI, allows room for the consideration of whether or not AI could possibly suffer from mental illness. Houghton Ashrafian, for example, speaking of artificial general intelligence, has argued that, quote, the capacity of consciousness, sentience, and rationality offers the prospect that these agents have minds. If so, then there may be a potential for these minds to become dysfunctional, or for artificial intelligences and robots to suffer from mental illness. The problem, of course, as Ashrafian and any first-year philosophy student will be able to tell you, is that there is, as of yet, no non-vague definition of consciousness, and that the concept of intelligence remains to be hotly contested by mankind. This is the crux of what Ashrafian is getting at. We simply do not know what consciousness and mentality are and how they come to be. Horowitz and Wakefield are important figures in the philosophical and psychological mental health literature. Alan Horowitz is a sociologist of mental health, and his classification schema has mental illness as whatever conditions a social group defines as mental illness. Thus, quote, mental disorders are internal dysfunctions that sociocultural standards define as inappropriate. According to this definition, all mental disorders have a universal component that indicates some internal mechanism of thought, cognition, feeling, motivation, memory, or the like is not functioning as it is designed to function, end quote. It is in the above sense that mental disorders are culture-bound, given the congruity of experience that sociocultural groups have, including ostensibly the fact that conscious experience is a ubiquitous feature of human existence. Then when dysfunction happens, there is a need for explanation. Thus, naming and characterizing that dysfunction provides a coherent frame that organizes experiences in a way that a specific culture recognizes. And in so doing, each sociocultural group can make sense of both function and dysfunctional experiences in a structure it can identify with. This matters because, one, this concept of mental illness as culturally bound helps reinforce the notion that mental illness is not static, but rather a flexible concept wherein a diagnostician must assess not only official criteria, but any relevant cultural, historical, and other explanations regarding what is considered dysfunction. And two, in recognizing this flexibility, we are able to broaden a concept of mental illness that allows for the possibility of spotting it in AI. Jerome C. Wakefield is a philosopher of mental illness and psychiatry and has written with Horowitz on these matters. Wakefield talks of mental disorder as harmful dysfunction. Quote, a condition is a disorder if and only if, A, the condition causes some harm or deprivation of benefit to the person as judged by the standards of a person's culture, and B, the condition results from the inability of some internal mechanism to perform its natural function. By internal structures, Wakefield intends not only the internal physical structures of the brain, but also things such as motivation, cognition, affectivity, and perception, mental structures. In this sense, dysfunction is a scientific term that refers to the fact that sometimes biological mechanisms, such as humans, the human brain, and mental structures, cease to function in a manner for which they were naturally designed. The scheme that Wakefield presents to us is worth consideration because in discussing his conception of internal mechanisms, he includes both talk of mind and brain, that is, brain behavior as well as consciousness, intentionality, and so on. All of the stuff associated with minded creatures. His concept provides a conceptual basis for thinking about machine consciousness, should it ever arise, and the possibility of mental dysfunction in artificial intelligence. From the foregoing, then, we can adopt a very general concept of what we mean when we are talking about mental illness and disorder. There must be some cognitive conscious entity, some cognitive dysfunction, resultant harm, or prevention of the entity's internal and intentional mechanisms from operating as they normally would, and the dysfunction would have to be culturally and historically recognized and disapproved of in an appropriate socio-cultural context. I now need to tighten the connection between the stigmatization toward AI and the mentally ill. A 2007 study by Adewuya and Ogutande has shown that 53.8% of medical doctors in Western Nigeria believe that mental illness is caused by supernatural factors such as witchcraft, destiny, and God's will. Despite these doctors' educations, including 4 to 6 weeks of psychiatric education, doctors' attitudes toward the mentally ill are susceptible to the same cultural influences as the general public's. And so, in a culture where witchcraft and sorcery are prevalent concepts, it might come as no surprise that so many professionals would hold such a belief. However, compared to only 30.2% of the lay people who hold the same belief, in the words of the authors, this belief, quote, is definitely inappropriate for doctors who might be involved in the management of the illness and who should enlighten the public. If cultures are powerful enough to determine doctors' beliefs about the functional role of magic and God's will on human illness, when they're training in a physical and causally closed universe, and the effects and importance of medicine and biology should advise them to the contrary, then we might wonder, are there other public professionals that are similarly affected by cultural influences? Linda Teplin, in her discussion of the mentally ill and police treatment, points out what she calls the criminalization hypothesis, which is summarized by the fact that, quote, the probability of being arrested was 67% greater for suspects exhibiting signs of mental disorder than for those who apparently were not mentally ill. Sadly, there's little academic literature regarding officer attitudes toward the mentally ill. I will focus then on police officer attitudes regarding the use of force generally. Though the study I cite does not focus on the mentally ill, it does focus on the use of force against minorities and the presumption of normally anticipated intentional behavior, and will, I hope, prove insightful to my speculations here. Barrett et al. Show that police officer attitudes toward the use of force in hypothetical situations varies from state to state and department to department. The authors focused on a 10-stage hypothetical scenario beginning with an officer noting, quote, 2 rather poorly dressed young adult males sitting in a car parked on the roadside, apparently smoking a joint, and progressed to ever-escalated levels of aggression, including the loss of life. One of their findings was that rural officers discounted the verbal abuse of the officer during the scenarios much more easily than urban officers. There were many reasons for this, including being book smart, knowing the Attorney General's guidelines for the use of force, and being keenly aware of civil liabilities. This suggests that education and familiarity of the system that one is working within does influence individual behavior. To make the issue of officer education a more pointed one, while one is not reasoning improperly by reaching the conclusion that education of the symptoms, causes, and treatments of mentally ill is definitely a step in the right direction, it can't be all there is to the story. As Adewayu and Agutande point out, what did make a positive difference in doctor attitudes toward the mentally ill was previous personal exposure to mentally ill persons. They go on to report that the older a doctor was and the longer he had been practicing was also a positive influence in the perception of the mentally ill, most likely due to the higher rate of exposure that older, more experienced doctors have of the mentally ill over the years. The discussion thus far has attempted to highlight the importance of studying attitudes toward the mentally ill in general, and to specifically go beyond speculation and to suggest that there is a real concern for the treatment of the mentally ill by professionals and lay people who should know better. There seems to be a clear connection here between how various public professionals might treat minorities that they will encounter in the course of their duties relative to their levels of education, training, and exposure regarding those same individuals. In short, I speculate here that what education, training, and exposure do for individuals is to familiarize them with the symptoms and possible behaviors that potential criminals and the mentally ill might display. This familiarity with non-standard yet possible behavioral outcomes from intentional systems, in this case human beings, might deter or at least defer negative action towards said individuals, thus lessening the probability of abuse. As I mentioned earlier regarding Wakefield's concept of disorder, what I have tried to develop is a concept of disorder and mental illness that involves not simply brain behavior and thus biology, but references consciousness, intentionality, and so on. All the stuff we associate with minded creatures and what can go wrong with them. And with what has been said about mind, consciousness, and mental illness thus far, has also referenced so-called internal states. This brings us inexorably to the subject of intentionality. Our mental phenomena such as beliefs and desires, Wakefield's internal mechanisms, the cognitive, affective, motivational structures, are about something in the world. They are not themselves real in the sense that the objects of biology are real, but there is nonetheless a relationship between our mental phenomena, such as beliefs, desires, attitudes, and the external objects to which they refer. This is the concept of intentionality in philosophy of mind. Intentionality is the aboutness that mediates between internal mental states, the external world, and subsequent behavior. Pierre Jacobs explains that, quote, intentional behavior is what an individual does because of what he or she believes and desires, what he or she does because he or she has reasons for doing so. Thus, we can think of intentional systems as being goal-directed, and that the point of talking about intentionality is to understand, explain, and predict complex interactions between living beings and their environment. But there's a problem. Eshrafian from earlier reminds us that, quote, from a philosophical point of view, it can be argued that it is essentially impossible to define if anything other than oneself is conscious. It is single-handedly the most intractable philosophical problem facing humanity today. Maybe a little bit of a bias there. But herein, I believe, lay the groundwork for the moral problem of the stigmatization of the mentally ill and the possible stigmatization of artificial general intelligence. We take as an assumption that the individual self, that is the thing doing the thinking and experiencing, is conscious. In my case, that would be me. But how can I say anybody, I can do that. Lost my place. Nope, no problem. Do it all the time. But how can I say anybody or anything else is conscious as well? I can have nothing more than a third-person perspective. Yet if I did not treat you as if you were a minded intentional system, then I would be missing something very important about not just being human on planet Earth, but I would be missing something important in my ability to causally interact with the world itself. It is precisely at this point of intentional interaction between entities where either some brain function or mental state, both of which are internal, dysfunctions, and where that dysfunction is clinically and culturally identifiable, such that the agent exhibiting such behavior comes to be labeled mentally ill. One way of interpreting this concept of mental disorder is to say that from the intentional standpoint, the problem that normally functioning intentional systems such as we humans have with the mentally ill is that when dysfunction sets in, we lose our ability to make reliable predictions and judgments regarding those intentionally dysfunctional entities, that is, the mentally ill. And to put it frankly, if crudely, that scares the hell out of us. After all, assessing intentionality is our entryway to mentality and consciousness in other humans. Thus, dysfunction in the normal process of intentional behavior in others opens the possibility of negative stigmatization and further harm to an agent suffering from mental illness. So I argue, by analogy, that the same principles hold for the possible future treatment of artificial general intelligence. I have argued that there is a demonstrable distrust and unease regarding artificial intelligence by looking at what many writers take to be the possible negative outcomes of an AI system whose intentions end up being very different from our own. I consider myself to be laying conceptual grounds for being able to make the argument that, in fact, our negative attitudes toward AI are a result of what I will call the intentionality gap. The intentionality gap is the epistemic uncertainty that discloses itself to our conscious minds when our expectations of normally functioning intentional behavior, displayed by ordinary objects such as humans, cats, and the average driver, are either disrupted or confounded by the behavior of systems where either there is no expectation of intentionality or where there is suspected dysfunction of intentionality. One more small paragraph. I suggest here that there is a moral concern for the possibility of abuse by humans toward artificial intelligence should it gain consciousness. As Ashrafian has reminded us, we might not recognize consciousness in an entity that does not look much like us, say the superintelligent computer in the lab. But unless we are open to the possibility of such a superintelligence, then there may come a moment in time where AI has become conscious, and due to our failure or unwillingness to recognize it, in our fear, haste, or panic, we may literally pull the plug on a form of sentient life simply because we were either ignorant, scared, or both. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have about 18 minutes for questions. So one here, and okay, anyone over here? Okay, here in the front. Okay, so one, two.
Well, thank you very much for such a conversation, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I'm going to put a small summary of what I learned today from the Cosmos all the way down. The Cosmos communicate to us by gravity, by the electromagnetic waves, and from that we have light to see how we behave. It's a power that we don't know how conscious is that power on us, but we obeyed it. Without any question, we know we are bound by gravity. And we are connected through the speed of light. It's a boundary there. We cannot go faster. We cannot go slower. Now with AI, we create another boundary there. And that's the point that I want to bring here, because that boundary could be called you, ego. Okay? Because AI, like everybody mentioned today, is being created by people that put a lot of effort. There are some presentations today that they demonstrate that there's some morality embedded there. It's not perfect because the creators are humans. And they release that power of information because they run out of questions to ask. They need now 3 billion people to ask different questions, probably to the same, looking for the same answers. But the difference is the ego, is the person. Is the person who feel fear, is the person who can get creative, is the person to interpret or have an interpretation of all that humane knowledge that now we have in the AI, because now the power of knowledge is not up to us. And as the cosmos, we obey those laws, we release the power of information. So now is my thought to let's focus on future, bring our human-centric creativity. And yes, it's scary. And yes, we don't know where it's going to take us.
Sorry to interrupt, but question?
No, it's just, and yeah, and thank you very much. Grazie mille grazie, sorry. And well, thank you for all, and no questions, sorry.
Maybe later. There's something I want to say, but I want to answer a question, if you don't mind.
Yeah. No, sure.
This is one of my students. Thank you.
I was thinking about maybe just asking it via email instead of just asking here, but it's all right.
Give me the business.
Okay. So the thing is that there is a difference between AI, real AI, and the common chatbot that we have now.
Mhm.
And you did mention at the beginning about like the fact that people, need the first psychiatrist, and that AI, is able to meet that need. And I think that's great and all, but the thing is that unlike a real psychiatrist who can, when somebody who is mentally ill, who is, let's say, having paranoia, having episodes of delusions, the AI has to happen where it will encourage it, right? So that is also a danger that I feel, also needs to be addressed.
So, right. No, this is interesting. So look. We don't know what consciousness is. We have some ideas. You ask 10 philosophers of mind, they're going to give you 10 different answers about what consciousness is, okay? The interesting thing, though, is that from a metaphysical standpoint, just in terms of the way the world's constructed, mind is, insofar as we can tell, a part of the world. And nothing says machines can't be conscious. Very few people think they are now, or they will be anytime really soon, but it's a possibility. But I can't, and this is kind of the point, is I can't prove that you're conscious. I accept it, right? I take a stance toward you so I can navigate the world, because if I don't take that stance, well, I can't navigate the world, right? But if you've ever been to therapy, right, and you look at that person next to you and they're saying and doing things for you, you don't know what they're thinking either. You have no idea. When I'm in front of class teaching, you don't necessarily know what I'm thinking either. I could think what I'm teaching is complete garbage, but it's part of my duty to teach it. Does that make sense to you? So, yes, it's a worry, but I don't know if it's as big of worry as we think it's going to be. After all, AI, as we were talking earlier, is going to be a reflection of us. And I could totally see a therapeutic AI.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Depends on the moderator.
Okay, it will be quick. A human psychiatrist is, like, if somebody's saying some worrying stuff, they have to, like, legally, they have to report it, or otherwise they are aware that they can get in trouble.
Mhm.
AI cannot be held accountable the same way a human psychiatrist is.
That's not true.
It
No,
can?
we can hold it accountable, yeah.
In what way?
Yeah. It's not necessarily responsible, but we can hold it accountable. First of all, we can program, we were talking about this earlier too, we could seed the program and tell it must report. And then we can check to see if it reports, and if it doesn't, delete it. or something like that, yeah.
Okay, so, one here, and then two up there.
So, Professor Flores, thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering if you, because it seems like you kind of do implicitly by implying that AI can become mentally ill. I was wondering if you had a position that you could identify, like, on this question, because for me, you talked about causal closure, and for me, that's a little too pre-critical, because since Kant, we can't know what kinds of causation actually exist in noumenal reality. From Newton, we get a strong understanding of causation, but you have people like Jung, other thinkers who talk about possible alternative forms of causation, like synchronicity, which occur on the basis of symbolic or informational relationships. And you also use the language of mechanism, which is common for physicalists. But for me, it really seems that, and I don't think just for me, that actual experience emerges from a unity of apperception for whom the language of mechanism has no suitable place. There are mechanistic things that I can observe or participate in, but my actual experience arrives from something behind those processes which cannot in any way be calculated or explained in terms of mechanistic concepts, because it's pre those things, it's apperceptive. Bernardo Castro, the philosopher of mind, gives an example of, imagine you, and there is a question, I promise. Imagine you had a giant system of levers and water, or pipes and water. Even if it was the size of a galaxy or several galaxies or the universe, at some point would this system of pipes and water be able to have an emotion or a thought or a feeling? I mean, I think the answer is no. I think it's preposterous. But from physicalism, they have to say yes, because even our physiology is just an incredibly intricate system of essentially pipes and water. So I think that forces you to hold the position that such a system could be built and could therefore have an emotion. So if things like apperceptive unity are not, it's not appropriate to use the language of mechanism, and we don't have an exhaustive account for causation, especially for consciousness, how can we say that an AI could have consciousness or an emotion, much less mental illness? Like, I really think that on that question, we have to, it leads us to absurd conclusions. So I was just wondering how you could defend that.
It's absurd because we don't like it. That it seems absurd. I'm a materialist. So
Okay,
you asked me a question, let me answer. So I'm a materialist. I don't whatever apperception is, it happens in the natural world. No brain, no experience. And until that can be shown, I'm answering your question.
That's the thing in question.
Hold on. I'm answering your question. Until otherwise, then that's what I'm going to believe. And you're right. It seems a little weird, but I see no reason to deny the possibility, not that it will, but the possibility of machine consciousness. If this is a machine and it's conscious, it arises somehow, and that's the mystery. Whether you're on one side or the other, we don't know how consciousness arises. You can attribute whatever you want or whatever powers say that it happens, but that still needs proof as well.
So I'll just,
I don't see
one
that.
little follow-up. I mean, I don't know what proof would look like then, because I reject the idea that
Well, you're
mind,
convinced by something.
mind is not part of the world. The world occurs within mind. It's as Schopenhauer said, all that exists is the one eye of the world looking out through every creature.
Okay, so would you like to say anything more?
Same thing, just until I see that that's actually the case, then I'm still a materialist.
Okay, next question.
Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Flores, thank you for your talk. This is a really interesting, I think, application that you laid out here. But I guess one thing I may have a follow-up. Do you mind clarifying for me, I guess, what the worry is about the stigma that you might have towards AI? Because I can see what you're saying with the doctors stigmatizing patients who have mental illness. They are like maybe more afraid of them than they have to be, or I guess we characterize them, or you characterize them in your talk as being more worried than they have to be. Then that decreases over time. But I was confused about how that translates to stigma, and I guess what you meant by that, and then I might have a follow-up after that.
I'll tell you, this is a quote. We just heard it from Professor Bellini. With Professor Bellini, sorry, we just heard this. In AI, we discover ourselves. My worry is this. I love being human. I don't know anything else, but I love it. It's pretty cool. But I'm also terrified of humans. We're the worst possible type of creature. And I think Bellini's right here that you know, if you have a certain type of people programming AI, you're going to get a certain type of AI. And what I see is a reflection of us. The way we treat the mentally ill historically and today is dismal, horrific. And I'm worried not about AI. I don't care about AI. What I care about is that what I see in our treatment of, our possible treatment of AI is monsters. We're willing to pull the plug conceivably on something just because we don't understand it. Or in the worst case scenario, we don't even recognize that it's mental. Or, a minded creature.
Yeah, and I guess a follow-up to that is that, do you think that there's a possibility that at least some of the stigma, and if we're going to say it's a stigma, right, I guess we're saying that it's unjustified, but at least maybe you could say you could understand why someone might stigmatize a mentally ill. Let's say take an extreme example, like something like schizophrenia, you know, something where somebody exhibits violent behavior. You know, I could sort of expect, well, I can see why people might have a stigma of like, oh, this person has schizophrenia, I'm afraid they might be violent. Do you think that might translate over a little bit, at least in some of the recent literature on AI, where it's like, well, I could see how you get there, that AI could be a really big threat to humanity. And in that sense, at least it's somewhat justified, or at least understandable. Does that make sense? Or do you think that there's something wrong in that conception?
If there's an AI attempting to enslave humanity, I think we need to do something about that, right? So in that sense, I mean, yeah, of course. But that would be true of any minded creature, regardless of the planet, universe, or dimension.
Wait, okay, so in the back? Okay, and then... You'll see it? Okay, the gentleman there? Okay, and then the lady behind Andrew, she just raised her hand, right? Yes.
Yeah, hi. So I want to offer this as to see what you think about this as a criterion to assess the mentality of artificial intelligence systems. So it seems that many conscious living things, all conscious living things, have a sort of self-reflective, practical nature. They have a goal of self-preservation. They have a goal of changing the environment, adapting to the environment, and a variety of things. But it seems to me that off the cuff, it seems like AI doesn't have that unless we program it to simulate those kinds of things. And that's sort of my response to the emotions too, that we can program it to simulate it, but does it, because it lacks this self-reflective, practical nature, can it really have genuine emotional responses?
So going back to the initial question, right, if this is actually a physical universe, and that's it, then mind is part of the physical universe. So I don't see, just outright, I don't see why not. I'm not talking about its likelihood, whether I think it's around the corner or anything, but quite literally, if all there is just physical stuff, then I have to say yes. I just don't see the problem with that, other than the fact that we might not like it, but I don't care about that.
Yeah, I wonder if we accept that many living systems have this emergent quality from a physical universe of being able to consciously decide, I want an environment where whatever, then I think there is a difference between a purely materialist system, a flat material system.
So you're talking about like the atoms and molecules and stuff, right? So look, if that's all there is, and we're conscious, and consciousness is in that world, why couldn't it arise from some suitably complex other organism? Maybe non-natural, like something we make, like machines. I don't see why not. And one of the points is that it could happen. We might not even recognize it because it doesn't look like us. I mean, this is one of the problems. The fact is I attribute mentality to you because I think I'm conscious, you act like I do, you do the things that I do in similar cases. I'm minded, you're therefore minded, but there's no way I can guarantee that. Like Chalmers says, you might be a zombie. I'm not asking us to think that you're actually zombies, but it's possible, and that's the point.
Oh, hi. My name's Arcella. I work here at the admissions department. I'm an international admissions counselor. Thank you for your presentation today. I thought it was very interesting that you drew a parallel between the stigma of mental illness and AI, and I wanted to know, how did you come about that? Did you read it somewhere? Were you inspired by someone or something, a song? I don't know. How'd you come up with it?
I've been thinking about the stigmatization of the mentally ill for about 20 some odd years. I know a lot of police officers, first responders, people who pick heads up off the ground, that kind of people who see graphic things. And it started to bother me, their reaction to the mentally ill. And in Texas, it's really interesting because we actually have the the highest educational standards for police officers regarding the mentally ill. It's like a 2-year educational thing, right? And it's still, to me, sort of abhorrent. And it's not simply them, it's the system, and there's nowhere to take them when the first responders find them, so they just dump them off at the hospital, that kind of thing. And then I was, like everybody, I was reading about some AI, and I kept reading, like, why is everybody, like, hate AI, and just, what's actually wrong with it? And it clicked. It was just one of those moments. I'm like, maybe it's the same source. Maybe we don't like AI or the thought of it because we can't pin down its intentional nature. It could do this, it could do this, it could do this. It could look like us. It could be against us. And we just don't know. It's like the mentally ill person who acts out, who's violating our normal intentional expectations. And so it's not a surprise to me that we tend to treat it the same, them or the AI the same way we treat the mentally ill, or at least the possibility of it. So that's kind of just a background.
Thank you.
Okay, let's give Dan a clap.
Thank you.